Geneva, 1961. Jaguar pulls the cover off the E-Type at the Swiss Motor Show, and within hours the crowd around it is so thick that buyers can barely get near the thing. The stand runs out of demonstrator cars completely, so a Jaguar test driver named Norman Dewis gets a phone call back in Coventry, jumps into a second E-Type and drives it through the night across Europe just to keep up with the demand. And the legend goes that when Enzo Ferrari, the man behind those scarlet Italian supercars, first laid eyes on it, he called it the most beautiful car ever made. So how did an affordable British sports car end up outshining the Ferraris that cost twice as much? But this story doesn't really start in Geneva. It starts on a racetrack in France. All the way through the 1950s, Jaguar had turned itself into a giant at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the most brutal endurance race in the world. The Jaguar C-Type won it, and then the sleek-finned D-Type won it 3 years running, beating Ferrari, Mercedes, and Aston Martin on their own turf. Those weren't lucky flukes either. Jaguar showed up at Le Mans with genuinely clever engineering, from disc brakes that could outstop the competition to bodywork shaped for pure speed down the long Mulsanne straight. So by the end of that decade, Jaguar wasn't just another car company from Coventry. It was a name that had beaten the very best of Europe out on the track, in front of the whole motoring world. Behind all of it was a man called William Lyons, the founder of Jaguar. Lyons had an obsession that shaped everything the company built. He wanted cars that looked expensive and went genuinely fast, but that ordinary people with good jobs could actually dream about owning one day. Back then, a real high-performance sports car was a toy reserved for the ultra-rich. If you wanted 140 miles an hour and a badge that turned heads on the street, you were shopping at Ferrari or Aston Martin, and you were spending the price of an actual house. Lyons looked at that whole world and decided there had to be another way to do it. And that brings us to the man who really shaped the E-Type, because he wasn't a car stylist at all. His name was Malcolm Sayer. And before he ever went near an automobile, he worked in the aircraft industry at the Bristol Aeroplane Company. Sayer didn't sketch pretty curves the way a fashion-minded designer might. He calculated them. He used mathematics and aerodynamics to work out the exact shape that would slip through the air with the least resistance, the same way you'd design the fuselage of an aeroplane. That long, low nose, the smooth cockpit, the way the whole body seems to stretch towards the horizon. None of it was decoration. Every single line on that Jaguar had a reason to be there. And here's the part most people never hear. A shape that was worked out with equations and wind resistance ended up becoming one of the most beautiful objects of the entire 20th century. I mean, think about that for a second. Malcolm Sayer sat down to solve a physics problem, and what came out the other side is a car that now sits inside art museums. The Museum of Modern Art in New York put a Jaguar E-Type into its permanent collection, one of only a tiny handful of cars ever given that honor. It earned that spot not for what it did on the road, but for how it looked standing still. Coventry, 1961. This is where Jaguar detonated the entire market. When the E-Type finally went on sale, it cost around £2,000 in Britain. A comparable Ferrari or Aston Martin cost you roughly double that. So for the price of one Italian exotic, you could buy the Jaguar and still have serious money left in the bank. In plain terms, you were getting Ferrari looks and Le Mans pedigree for doctor money instead of millionaire money. A machine that looked like it belonged to royalty, priced for a successful dentist or a young pop star. And then there was the number that ran in newspapers all around the world. Jaguar claimed the E-Type could hit 150 miles an hour. In 1961, that was almost unbelievable. A road car as fast as a proper race car. The British motoring press took it out, ran it flat out, and sure enough, the needle swung around to 150. But here's the detail almost nobody talked about at the time. The particular cars that Jaguar handed to journalists were almost certainly tuned and fettled to make that magic figure, running a little sharper than the ones rolling out of the showroom. That seemed like a small bit of showmanship back then. It wasn't. That headline, Top Speed, became a permanent part of the legend, and the legend sold Jaguars by the thousand. There's a reason people are still talking about this car more than 60 years later, and it goes way beyond the engineering. The E-Type landed right in the middle of the 1960s, just as London was becoming the center of the entire pop culture universe. This was the era of the Beatles, Carnaby Street, and the whole swinging 60s explosion, and the E-Type quickly became its unofficial mascot. If you were young, rich, and famous in that world, you didn't simply want one of these Jaguars. You needed one parked outside. The story goes that Frank Sinatra spotted an E-Type in New York and flatly announced, "I want that car, and I want it now." George Harrison of the Beatles went out and bought one. Actors, musicians, fashion models, racing drivers, they all lined up for the same car. At that point, the E-Type stopped being a vehicle and turned into a symbol, a piece of rolling 1960s cool that told everyone on the street exactly who you were the moment you pulled up to the curb. If you're enjoying this story of how one British car took over the world, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button. I dig into the machines and the moments that shaped history every single week. While Jaguar was soaking up all this attention in London, something much bigger was happening across the Atlantic. The real prize was America, and by now this wasn't just about Britain anymore, because the United States was the largest car market on the whole planet, and it was where Jaguar earned most of its money. Wealthy Americans fell hard for the E-Type. It carried European racing glamour, it looked like nothing else on their wide open highways, and it comfortably undercut the Ferraris and Astons those same buyers had been staring at. The large majority of E-Types ever built ended up shipped across the ocean and parked in American driveways, from Beverly Hills mansions to quiet suburban garages in the Midwest. And this is the answer to the question we started with up on that Geneva stand. How did an affordable British car beat the Italian exotic elite at both beauty and pure desirability? It won on looks because Malcolm Sayers' calculated shape was simply impossible to argue with. It won on price because you got all the Ferrari drama for half of the money. And it won on timing, arriving in the exact decade when the whole world wanted a piece of young, fast, glamorous Britain. Ferrari built cars that were faster and rarer, sure, but the Jaguar E-Type pulled off something Ferrari never could. It made that whole intoxicating world feel like it was almost within reach of a normal person. But the same free-spirited character that made the E-Type so special was about to get regulated right out of it. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the United States began bringing in strict new safety and emissions laws, and because America was Jaguar's biggest customer, those rules quietly reshaped the car. Those gorgeous glass covers over the headlights had to be stripped off. The bumpers grew taller and heavier. The engines got choked back to meet the emissions targets, which sapped away some of that famous performance. And for a car sold on speed, that was not exactly ideal. Later versions grew bigger and heavier, and Jaguar eventually dropped in a huge V12 engine just to claw the speed back. The E-Type was still fast and still lovely, but that pure, delicate machine from 1961 had slowly matured into something softer and more grown up. By 1974, it was all over. Jaguar ended production of the E-Type after more than a decade on sale. and the car passed into history. But here's the twist that Norman Dewis, driving through the night back in '61, could never have seen coming. Most iconic cars quietly fade in value once the world moves on. This one did the exact opposite. Today, a well-kept early E-Type can sell for hundreds of thousands of pounds at auction. Houses like Bonham's and the very finest examples go for a great deal more than that. The car that once cost you half a Ferrari is now, for a lot of serious collectors, worth chasing every bit as hard. So think back to that crowd pressed around the Jaguar stand in Geneva in 1961, staring at a car so beautiful that the company had to send a second one racing through the night across Europe just to keep up. That whole scene and that line Enzo Ferrari supposedly said about the most beautiful car ever made, it genuinely all still holds up today. 6 decades later, the Jaguar E-Type is still parked near the top of almost every list of the most beautiful cars ever built. A modest British company took on the Italian supercar aristocracy, and it beat them with mathematics, with racing pedigree, and with a price tag that finally let ordinary dreamers in on the fantasy. If you want to see how another underdog machine rewrote the rules of its entire era, the video on screen right now is the perfect place to head next.